Terrific.
I guess the host has to do it. So Lee, you can set that up.
Well, welcome. Welcome everyone to the second of our 3-panel discussions on envisioning statehood. Last month, we looked at taking back our justice system. We've put the link to the recording of that in the chat. And tonight, our focus is government by the people. I'm Kathy Chiron, president of the League here in DC. Just to remind, the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to empowering voters and defending democracy. We are well aware that we are right in the middle of an election campaign season. So we want to be clear that the League does not advocate for or against any candidate or party. As a group that works on full representation for everyone living in DC, we acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the Nacotchunk, also known as Anacostan and Piscataway peoples, and we pay respect to their elders past and present. We also acknowledge that after DC was founded, enslaved people worked the land and built much of the early infrastructure and buildings. We pay respect to them and their descendants. Our purpose tonight is to explore some aspects of how our local government will be affected when we become a state. Why are we looking at this now? Well, because in the 221 years since DC was founded, we have never been this close to achieving statehood. We've been getting lots of questions about what would change. So we went to the experts who have been working on this, and they'll bring us up to date on all these issues. We expect a good, substantive discussion and ask us all to please assume good intentions from all participants. Let's listen to each other, learn from each other, and feel free to enter your questions in the chat. They'll be picked up during the Q&A period after our panelists have spoken and had a short discussion period with the moderator. You've already noticed that we are recording for future viewing and live transcription is available. I now have the distinct honor of introducing our moderator, Ann Anderson, who will then introduce the panelists. Ann is the chair of our Committee for Full Rights for DC Citizens. She's lived in DC since 1964, the first year since 1801, you all know that, when DC citizens were allowed to vote for president. She has been an advocate for DC statehood since 1971. And as a clinical social worker, has a psychotherapy practice with Washington Therapy Guild, and has 3 children, all DC natives. So Ann, over to you.
All right. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to our distinguished panelists who will be sharing their expertise with us tonight. Our title for tonight's presentation feels particularly poignant to me in light of Representative Clyde's recent comments. Now, I just want to read from Eleanor Holmes Norton's press release. She condemned Representative Andrew Clyde, Republican of Georgia, for once again calling for repeal of the District of Columbia Home Rule Act. For those of you who haven't been with the League for a long time, the League was substantially involved in getting the Home Rule Act passed, because there were almost 1 million petition signatures that were, submitted from the League. So basically, he made a statement during the debate in the Committee on Oversight and Reform on Norton's bill that would allow DC to transmit legislation to Congress for the review period electronically. For those of you who don't know, we still have to send paper over. So here's a quote from Ms. Norton. As his statement today demonstrated yet again, Representative Clyde plainly wants the federal government to resume running DC as a colony. He wants to take away even the limited self-government that nearly 700,000 DC residents, a majority, of whom are minorities, have had for the last 50 years and give Congress and presumably congressionally or presidentially appointed administrators day-to-day control over DC. She also goes on to say, at a time when we're having unprecedented success on our statehood bill, we'll continue to move forward, not go back. So she's planning on defeating his anti-democratic efforts. So yay, she probably will, but in the meantime, it's just so stark. So, you know, back in '64, we got to vote for president, but we were still ruled by presidential appointees. And I remember the excitement and hope for full democracy as the Home Rule Act went into effect. And then I also remember the commitment to building democracy in the 70s and 80s and the push for passage of the statehood bill in the 90s. So here we are now in 2022, and against all odds, we've never been closer to gaining statehood. And one of the measures for how close we are is the intensity of the opposition we face. So we are now even daring to envision how it would work, an exercise that's critical to providing as smooth a transition as possible to statehood, to government by the people, us. We want to focus this evening on the basic question: what happens the day after we join the Union as a state equal to the other 50 states? So tonight we have 3 people who've been deeply engaged in working on DC governance and statehood: John Bouker, Beverly Perry, and Kathy Patterson. To save time for our discussion, because all of these people have really long CVs, we're putting their detailed bios in the chat, and we'll have each of them introduce themselves. Please put your questions in the chat so that we can address them during the Q&A. Each panelist will have 5 to 10 minutes to give their presentation, and then we'll follow with a few minutes of discussion among the panelists and then open the floor for questions from the audience. So without further ado, let me turn it over to John Bouker, who will help us understand the current constitution of our new state. John, take it away.
Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you, Kathy, and the other members of the League, not only for inviting me here tonight to frankly talk about my favorite subject, so my arm didn't need to be twisted at all, but also for your steadfast support of DC rights, really from the very beginning. You know, you are the OG of DC rights supporters, going back, as you just mentioned, to the Home Rule Act, and every milestone since. So thank you for that. I am John Bouker. I have been working on these issues for my entire adult working life. I've been in the District of Columbia now for, God, more than 30 years. Came here to go to school and worked for Eleanor Holmes Norton, who I met in law school as my professor. So I was with her for 10 years, working on all of the DC rights issues that she worked on, where I really got my appetite for this, and to help ensure that every resident of the District of Columbia has the same rights that every other resident of the country has. And for the past 20 years, I've been at the law firm Arent Fox Schiff, where I continue to work on these issues as I've chaired the board of DC Vote. I've chaired the board of DC Appleseed, organizations which are dedicated to DC rights and statehood. And most recently, by invitation of our esteemed panelist, Beverly Perry, I've been part of a legal group that has been helping advise Beverly and the mayor on statehood issues, including drafting the Constitution, which I'm going to talk about for a couple of minutes. But I thought first I could just very quickly frame how we got to sort of this most recent round of statehood. And frankly, again, it begins with Beverly Perry and the mayor in 2016, when we were all convinced that Hillary Clinton was going to be the next president of the United States. And we wanted to be ready and wanted to hand over our package to the new president and the new Congress for statehood. And so Beverly arranged a meeting with a bunch of us who have been working on this for a long time and said, well, what are your ideas? And we gave her all sorts of wacky ideas. And I'm not sure any one of us said statehood, even though statehood has always been the ultimate goal for many of us, because it's, it's a difficult thing to achieve. And Beverly said no, and the mayor said no, we're going to do statehood. And we're going to follow something called the Tennessee Plan, which is something that states or territories coming into the union that the Congress has not said, y'all come. It's what they've used to be admitted into the union. And I'll just say the elements of it because it becomes important for the Constitution later, that along pursuant to the Tennessee Plan, you have to define what the boundaries of the state are. You have to write a constitution. You have to have a vote, a plebiscite saying you want to be a state. And you have to say that you're going to adopt a Republican form of government. And I have to tell you that when we put together the ballot referendum, we changed that to Democratic representative form of government because we thought that DC residents might get a little confused if we asked them to vote for something with the word Republican in it. So we changed it to Democratic representative, which we thought accomplished it in any event. So Beverly masterminded a constitutional convention where all DC residents were delegates. She and the mayor solicited hundreds of comments. And in our little pregame chat, I noted that the thing that was commented most about was the name. What would we name this new state, which of course we're naming Washington, DC, Douglas Commonwealth. And then we had meetings among this legal group to put together the Constitution that ultimately was submitted to the people of the district, to the Statehood Commission, and also to the council and the mayor for adoption. And we decided that we wanted to keep it simple. We wanted the Constitution to mirror as closely as it could our existing structures to start, right? Because we wanted to make this seamless. We didn't have a lot of time to put it together because we wanted to put it together in time for the new president. And we also didn't want to do anything that would alarm the Congress, particularly with respect to our finances. Congress, as you know, has been very involved over the years in our financial controls, including back to the control board in '95, the powers of the chief financial officer and the like. So we wanted to make sure that we had all that in there so that nobody in the Congress would say, what are these folks, what are these folks doing? So after the passage of this and essentially the adoption of it, obviously the election didn't go the way we thought it was going to go. But it's good that we've done this work because now, we've passed statehood in the House twice. And so we are ready when statehood comes. And I agree that we are closer than we've ever been before. So we've done the hard work of putting together the Constitution, drawing the boundaries, which shrinks the federal district to a very small area of just sort of the federal buildings around the mall. And the rest of this is the state of Washington, D.C. So let me quickly just sort of run through the critical, provisions here. And I know that Beverly is going to talk in depth about the executive branch, and Kathy's going to talk about the legislative branch. But the Constitution begins with something, again, that Beverly and the mayor insisted upon, which many state constitutions do, which is to reiterate the Bill of Rights, which is important that we in the district, believe as a state in the Bill of Rights. Article 1 is the legislative branch, and ultimately the council decided that the legislative branch initially would consist of 21 members, which Kathy will talk about in a bit, with members that were sent at large, and then 2 from each ward. We kept the ward structure, again, trying to keep this as simple as possible, and 4-year terms for the members of the legislature. I know Kathy will talk about the powers of the legislature in a bit, but again, we wanted to mirror it as closely to what the council does now in this new assembly, the legislative branch. So the chairman, of course, becomes the speaker, and members of the council become representatives. We kept the concept of advisory neighborhood commissions. That's not something that other states have, but it's something we have, and it's something that's very important to our people. So we decided that that's something that, that we should retain. So that remains. We kept, of course, the office of the Attorney General, which will be the Attorney General for the state. Our Attorney General functions in many ways now as a state Attorney General and is recognized as such by other states. So we formalized that and making the Attorney General the chief law enforcement officer chief law officer rather of the state. And then again, in order to make sure that we kept sound financial procedures and also to make sure that Congress knew that sound financial procedures were important to us, we kept the office of the chief financial officer with the strong powers that it has. Of course, the very first elected government that we had in the District of Columbia was the Board of Education. So we kept the State Board of Education as well. And then the judicial power of the district of the state of Washington, D.C., Douglas Commonwealth. Of course, the governor will now appoint the judges going forward. And we kept the same structure in terms of a judicial nominations commission that would make those recommendations to the governor, and that the judges would be appointed for 15 years, just like they are now. But it's no longer the president of the United States making the appointments. Of course, it's the governor who would do that. There's a whole section in the Constitution about financial matters, including the submission of the budget and how the budget process works. Again, we have power over our own affairs as a state, so we have full budget autonomy without having to send the budget up to the Congress for any reason whatsoever. We kept the sound provisions in here for emergency and contingency funds, for how the district would borrow, how the district would, handle its bonds, the taxing power, all of these things hew very closely to what we have now, including the check that the district has on how much it's allowed to borrow. We put into the Constitution that 17% of our revenues is the cap for what we can borrow. That's what it is now. We kept the provisions for initiative, referendum, and recall, because those are things that DC residents, of course, have come to expect. But what was critically important was that, we didn't think that we had all of the, knowledge in the world here to get this right at the outset. So we put a very important provision in here that 2 years from statehood becoming live, that we would have on the second anniversary of the admission, we would have a constitutional convention, another full-blown constitutional convention where we will have elected delegates that will be sent, and where they will review the work that we did in this Constitution and decide whether it makes sense to keep these provisions or to change them or to expand them. And we thought that that was critically important because we were moving quickly, and we don't have some magic wand where we have all the knowledge in the world to know what the district residents would want in terms of 2 years down the line and following. Importantly, there's a transfer provision in here that the existing high government officers of the District of Columbia immediately become officers of the state. The chairman becomes the speaker, the mayor becomes the governor, the council members become representatives, because it's important to have continuity of government. All of the laws in force at the time that statehood is passed, remain in force, but of course can be changed by the new legislature. So again, making sure that this is as seamless as possible, right? Having a constitution which mirrors our own system as closely as possible, but building in 2 years from the admission for us to be able to take a look at it and to see what we got right and what we got wrong, and to see if there's anything that needs to be changed. Let me just quickly say before I close something about the Admissions Act, because there are two laws that are important here, right? There's the Constitution, but there's also the Admissions Act. We don't get to be a state without passage of the Admissions Act, and that's of course what the House has now passed twice in the past 2 Congresses. And it largely tracks the Constitution. that we've passed. It puts in place the provisions for the election of the senators and of the new representative. It abolishes the office of the delegate. So we would have to, hold those elections, and those procedures are there. It tracks the boundaries that we've laid out of what the state will be versus the capital that, obviously has to remain, pursuant to the Constitution, that the laws, still remain in effect, and that there's no change there, at least at first. But again, I think the most important provision of the Statehood Admissions Act, besides turning us into a state, is that there's again a 2-year process. Now, our rights don't take us 2 years to get. Upon admission, we have our rights. We have the rights that every other American citizen has. But in terms of putting the structures together, the agencies of government, the architecture, all of that kind of stuff, and making sure that there's an orderly transfer from whatever the federal government had, the district has to have, whatever the district needs to set up. There's a provision in here that calls for this 2-year period where those things all will occur. And there is a body that will be set up to assist with that, and which will have representation from the federal government, from the local government, to ensure that the new government of the District of Columbia, Washington Douglas Commonwealth, that the Statehood Transition Committee is there to serve the new government and to make sure that we have this orderly transition. So I think there's a view that day one of statehood is kind of a switch flipped and all this has to happen on day one. That's not the case. And no state has ever had it happen, on day one. There is, an orderly transition that's built into both our Constitution and the Admissions Act to allow us to do this in the right way. Someone's asking about the 23rd. So I'll just very quickly say, and I promise I'll be quiet, that the issues that have come up, that we of course have dealt with respect to the Constitution and the Admissions Act. First is the constitutionality of all of this. Hey, how can you shrink down the District of Columbia, the federal capital, to this little thing? Well, that's easy. The Constitution says it has to be not greater than 10 miles square, so it can be smaller than 10 miles square, so that's not a problem. What do you do with the 23rd Amendment? Will this new tiny little capital, that's the mall and the federal buildings, have its own members of Congress? Will it continue to have its own delegate? Will it continue to be able to vote for president who's ever living there, and have electoral votes? No. The 23rd Amendment, the enforcement provisions of it are repealed in the Admissions Act. Remember, every amendment to the Constitution says that this amendment shall be enforced by congressional legislation, and there is legislation that enforces it. So we take that away, and then we think that pretty quickly after that, the 23rd will be repealed through the normal repeal process, through the states. And then the other thing that's come up is cost. How are you going to afford all of this? Well, the Constitution gives us full state taxing power. And so therefore, we can more than afford the state functions that the government will now have to be responsible for. So I will stop there, but that's sort of an overview of the architecture of all of this. Thanks, Ann.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I think we've got a good framework to then shift to some of the more specifics. So now we're going to hear from Beverly Perry, who's going to talk about the executive side of this and how this will all work. So Beverly, please introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, Ann. Thanks to the two Cathys, and thank you, John. I think John gave us a really good summary and basically took a lot of what I was going to say, but I think it worked well to have that up front. Unlike John and you and most of the people that deal with statehood, I came to statehood with a fresh mind in 2015 when Mayor Bowser was sworn in to become mayor. I never worked on the issue before. And so the mayor said to me, I want to move the ball on statehood. And you will have a fresh look because you don't know anything about it. And she said, I want you to move this ball, but it cannot involve me going back to jail. So that was our charge. And having never worked on it before, I had a lot of research to do. I came to the government after a corporate career, retired corporate official. And so I looked at the past hearings and I came upon the testimony of Professor Viet Dinh, a Georgetown law professor who was also a Republican and had been the Assistant Attorney General under President Bush. And so I called Professor Dinh and asked if he would meet with me and talk to me about statehood, and he did. And so he, this notion that the whole plan came out of a conversation with Professor Dinh, the notion that 2016 would be the perfect year for us to pursue it, but we had to be ready. 2016 was set the stage for 2017 for us. If we were just ready, and we would have there would be a favorable executive in the White House, and the House and the Senate were both believed to be favorable to statehood. And so you heard John talk about the Tennessee plan, and we had to convene the constitutions and all that. So we did that. So what did we do? What have we done differently? And I think we have moved the ball, as you heard John say, that the House has passed it twice. In the Senate, we have 46 co-sponsors. We have 2 Democrats that are holding out and 2 independents who have pledged support. We believe there's still a path forward. And, who knows what could happen in a lame duck session. But to say what happens with the executive, the interesting thing, and someone asked a question about what happens to the Home Rule Charter. The Home Rule Charter now is in effect our Constitution. So when the day that statehood passes, the Constitution that we have drafted in that painstaking exercise that John participated in will become our Constitution. And we have done to move the ball. I think we've tried to keep the issue out in the forefront and try to educate people on that issue. And so it gives me a great pleasure to say, what will the executive be? We will have a governor. We will still have a unique jurisdiction. We will still operate as a county, a city, and a state. And the governor will be the executive over all of the operating agencies as it is now. The Attorney General will be the Attorney General, Chief Legal Officer, and we will have a State Board of Education and the operating agencies. With that, I think I'm going to stop because we've taken, some time, and I'll wait for other questions unless there is something else you want me to address right now.
Thank you. That sounds like a good transition because, like you say, John gave us the overview, and those are the pieces that we needed to put in place. So let me move on to the legislative branch and bring in Kathy Patterson.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anne. And good evening, everyone. Good to see so many friends of long standing. So it's good to be with you, and thank you to the League. The perspective that I bring to this conversation comes from my own time in the DC government, 3 terms as a member of the DC Council representing Ward 3 from 1995 to 2007. And then I came back to the DC government at the end of 2014 as the DC Auditor, which is a legislative audit shop considered part of the legislative branch, named by the council, confirmed by the council, and we do performance audits seeking to improve the efficiency of the government. So that's the background that I bring, as well as having raised 2 children in the District of Columbia, which is fraught because it's not fun to raise children where you don't have equal representation. And I do recall both my children went to college in New England, and they could leave their home of DC and go where they could then that fall vote for senators and such things. So I might bring the perspective of a parent who really does not like that idea. I don't want grandkids, brought up in the district without being part of a state. One of the things I think is important to say, and Beverly touched on this, is what we are already. The Council of the District of Columbia is a city council. It is a county commission. It is a state legislature. There are practically no issues the council does not deal with. We deal with Medicaid policy, with criminal justice issues, with everything across the board, with the exception of oversight for the court system. And that is one thing that would be different when we are a state, that would then be part of the legislative oversight as occurs in other states. I think it's important to understand that one of the strong arguments for statehood, and this is on behalf of both the legislative and the executive, is we are doing most of this today. We are serving our citizens. We are, as I said, enacting policies, the council overseeing policies across the board. There are some ways in which a lot of headway has been made, and I want to thank a lot of folks who are here tonight for that. When I was on the council, for example, every year when we enacted a budget, it had to go up to the Hill and become an appropriation, and the Congress had to bless how we would spend our DC tax dollars. That has changed. That changed during the period of time I was out of DC government. The council just enacted a budget in concert with the mayor, and the local budget, the huge portion of the budget, does not need approval by the Congress, as had been the case in the past. So we are making some headway here. I think one of the things that we should be thinking about are all the transition kinds of issues. And John did a good overview. The legislature in statehood under the Constitution would be enlarged. The people who are council members today would continue to serve, but they would be paired with another set of representatives. Each ward would have 2. We would continue to have at-large representatives, continue to elect a leader of the legislature citywide. And some of the things that we could be thinking about now are what kinds of things can we be doing now to be ready for that? We have 13 council members today. We have a host of issues that are dealt with. Perhaps we think in terms of what would committees look like with a much larger legislature and with broader authority when you bring in the judicial branch of government within the ambit of the legislature. So perhaps we start by making sure that each one of our elected officials is a chair of a committee, so that we start spreading out some of that work. That's not the case today. That's just one example of something that could be a transitional issue. Another thing the council could be doing is to assess what state-like functions are we not taking on today. Let me just throw out one example that occurs to me from the pandemic. One thing a number of states did, and tracked by the National Conference of State Legislatures, a number of states enacted legislation around how the state would spend COVID-19 mitigation money from the federal government. The council did a lot of legislation, but we did not enact legislation on how the funding would be spent. So I just use that as one example. There may be other issues that states are dealing with today, and it behooves the legislature today to be aware of what kinds of issues other states might be addressing that we are not yet today, for whatever reason that might be before us. So these are some of the things that I think we can be starting to think about as we think about the transition to becoming a state. And I think there will be a panel discussion looking at some of the judicial aspects. And I think your final panel, I think, will be looking at the funding. So I won't go into some of those issues, but there are a lot of issues to be dealt with there in terms of how we would redo our funding structure to be able to pay for the additional services that we would be taking on as a state. I think the only other thing I would like to mention are some of the arguments that we can continue to be making for the very critical importance of statehood. One of the things the legislature does today is enact sense of the council resolutions to say, we think the following should occur, and then send that up to the Congress because it's something that we don't have the authority to do right now. Let me give you one example. On the horrors of January 6th last year, our mayor had to go through all kinds of hoops in order to get the National Guard to be deployed. And I know we've made an effort to change that legislatively so that for that purpose, our mayor is a governor and can call out the National Guard. That's another one of those transitional issues that we should try to address in this interim period between now and when we do get admitted as a state in the United States. So there may be a series of other issues that we would want to think of like that one, where as a state, we would have a particular additional power or authority that we can seek to get now so that we can begin exercising it. And I think that's a good example that has been before us. So let me stop there and say, let's go on to questions and go on to continue this conversation. But I very much appreciate the opportunity to be with you tonight.
And can I just underline something that Kathy just said?
Sure.
So I think it's very important, when looking at this in terms of the powers that we would have, and Kathy raises, the awful situation where the mayor had to ask for the National Guard to have a president who wasn't going to deploy it. That, of course, is something that, that the governor would, certainly be able to do. But there's been some fear that we'll be admitted to the Union with conditions. After all, the Congress, has tried to meddle in our affairs and has meddled in our affairs for years. So why wouldn't they this time? Well, the reason is they can't. For example, we're banned from having a non-resident income tax in the Home Rule Act. As Kathy mentioned, the mayor doesn't have the authority to call the guard. The Congress can't pass the Admissions Act with the exceptions that, we couldn't have those things. The Supreme Court has confirmed a doctrine called the Fair Footing Doctrine, which essentially is, when you're a state all the way. And you can't admit a state to the Union that has less power, less authority than other states are given. A state is a state. So there's no constitutional basis for the Congress to be able to take those things away from us on condition of making us a state. I just wanted to make sure that was clear.
Great, thank you very much. This is now a little bit of a time for us to be able to talk panelist to panelists and moderator. And I actually have a question that I'd like to just sort of open up to the three of you. So part of what I've been doing is I've been thinking about this, and people say, I actually have had somebody say, DC can't be a state, it's this little scrap of, territory. What are you talking about? She was really astonished and horrified. And all of you have said something about we're a county, we're a state, we're a city. So I've been thinking about maybe what we really are is an urban state. And what does that mean? Rather than, there are other people who say, well, we're the cows, right? And how about the mining? What about, so we're clearly going to be very unique. We're unique. Well, every state is unique. So could you all talk some about how you're seeing how all of these things would sort of blend and meld and grow us into what I'm calling an urban state.
Well,
I
you
think
know,
that, go ahead.
well, what I was gonna say is, one of the things that we did differently, we drew the boundary and gave the Congress a map to identifying the streets and drew it out so they could see the block of what the federal jurisdiction would be. Many people say we can't be a state because it's a federal jurisdiction, but the federal jurisdiction is just federal triangle, you know, and there are parks in Washington, D.C. that are not connected to federal triangle, just like there are parks, federal parks in Maryland. So we have explained that, and I think the point that we have to make to people is that there is nothing in the Constitution that speaks to geography, that a state needs to have a certain geography. All a state has to have is certain boundaries. And it is the people, it's a personal representation, it's a personal privilege that's offered by the Constitution that makes people a jurisdiction eligible to become a state. It is the people. And right now we have more people than 2 other states. And there are 3 or 4 other states that we're on the heels of having as many as they do.
We're coming for Alaska. We're coming for you, Alaska.
Yes. So.
Okay.
No, and that's a very good point. And that's something I was going to say, reading one of the story news articles about the election in Alaska, I was reminded that that is roughly their population, about 700,000. So you're absolutely right.
Right.
And I think there are other states that are anomalies. I mean, one of the things we look at in some of the education issues we look at, sometimes we look at what Hawaii is doing, because that's a state that its school system is singular, just like ours. Its school system is the same as the state. So it's sort of an outlier, but it's sort of like us in that sense. So each state is unique, as Beverly said, and there are all kinds of arguments that you can throw back at that person, Ann.
Yeah, and I mean,
The hard thing,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Beverly.
John, let me just say this. I think the hardest thing to convince people is that we're not wards of the federal government. They do not pay us any more money than they pay anyone else. As a matter of fact, we get less than most states. But most people think that we live on a federal payment, and we don't. So the educational job that we have tried to do is to assure people that not only are we full American citizens with participating in wars and whatever other commitment every other citizen paying taxes, but we are not getting, our fair share back. And that is a very hard argument. People just clearly do not believe it.
And
Yeah.
it's true. It's true. And this system that we have now exists because of a historical glitch. And many of you probably know this story, that when the Congress was meeting in Philadelphia, there were Revolutionary War pensioners who came to petition the federal government about their pensions, and it got a little out of hand. Now I keep seeing like these older pensioners like rioting or something. I don't know how much of a riot it really was, but the Congress, because it didn't have its own militia or military at that time there in Philadelphia, asked the state for help. And the state said, no, you're on your own. This is your problem, not our problem. They're not petitioning us, they're petitioning you. And so that's why the provision was written into the Constitution, giving the federal government full and complete, plenary, whatever you want to call it, authority, exclusive jurisdiction over the national capital, because they didn't want to have a problem like that again. Well, I mean, the federal government I mean, I've seen the Pentagon, they're fine. They can, they can handle, folks, who are mad at them, right? So, it is a historical glitch that doesn't exist anymore. And, for me, it always comes down to the fact that, and like Kathy and others, I've got 2 kids who are native Washingtonians. And, it comes down to their rights and our rights. And whether or not we should be treated differently than folks, who live right across a river or right across a boundary. I mean, where I live is literally a block away from Maryland. And, you go across the street and those folks have more rights than I do. Well, they're no different than I am. And so, I think that, obviously it's high time that we fix this. And I think that the process that Beverly and the mayor put forward and that the council and district residents adopted, is a sound way to begin.
Well, and it's clearly been working because we have it passed twice by the House. I want to refocus on this transition process because it's really helpful when I think about, okay, we'll have our rights, but then we have a couple of years to actually make the shift. And John, I think you mentioned a statehood transition body of some kind.
Yes.
Who's in charge of putting that together? Like, who would actually make sure that it was properly representative, those kinds of things?
Yeah, well, I'll look up the provision while we're talking, but it's basically named here at Statehood Transition Commission. So there are 3 members appointed by the president, 2 by the Speaker of the House, 2 by the minority leader of the House, 2 appointed by the majority leader of the Senate, 2 appointed by the majority of the Senate, minority leader of the Senate, 3 members appointed by the mayor, 3 members appointed by the council, and the chief financial officer of the District of Columbia. So it's balanced between federal officials or those appointed by federal officials and those appointed by local officials. And essentially the duties are to advise, the new government of the state of Washington, D.C. With respect to an orderly, the way the bill says it is an orderly transition to statehood for the state.
And is this in the Admission Act?
Yes.
Okay.
So this is federal law,
Right.
in the Admissions Act.
Okay.
And again, I mean, your last discussion, I think, makes this point, beautifully as to why you need time. Because of the Revitalization Act in 1997, where the district voluntarily gave up the costs of certain state functions, as you learned last time, courts, prisons, for example, certain other functions, our system of criminal justice, are prosecuted by the Justice Department, for example, the U.S. Attorney, our judges are appointed, by the president. So it's very complicated. It's intertwined, and to unravel all that, you can't just do that in a day. It's going to take time to do that. But the key point, again, as I said earlier, is that we don't transition to our rights. Day one, we are full and equal citizens with the rights and responsibilities of every other citizen of the country. But these structures of government will take time.
Yeah, and I mean, here we are, we sit here in Washington, D.C. We know how people drag their feet. So is there any kind of position, like, all right, by the end of the month of the, first month, is there something that says by then we will have this?
Yeah, I mean, essentially what both the Constitution and the Admissions Act say is 2 years, and that's consistent with other states. And
Okay.
Beverly, you look like you want to speak to this because the executive is going to have to do this.
I believe Alaska had a 10-year transition plan.
Yeah.
And so, and what transition entails also is negotiations, like what things will what responsibility will
Very good
remain
point.
federal? You know, there may be some things that may remain federal, especially like in Alaska, it was the oil, it was the drilling, it was a lot of land, it was, so that negotiation period, also, that's what the transition is. It's an opportunity to negotiate any issues that were not addressed.
Yeah, that's critical. And other examples of that are, will we allow the state's police to go into, the federal district and to, and to be able to, do policing there. And if they do, the federal government's going to have to pay us for that. We're not going to do that for free. We're not going to clean the streets for free if they want us to clean their streets. Just like any other state, we would have to have some sort of agreement, as Beverly says, some negotiation as to what we're going to do for them, what they're going to do for us, and how it's going to be paid for.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay, and so let me shift that then to Kathy and ask her about, for instance, how would these additional representatives or assemblymen or whatever it is that we're calling them, I can't keep.
Representatives.
Okay, representatives get added to our legislature.
I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know that if it may well be in the Constitution, but I'm not quite sure.
Yes.
My assumption is it would be the next round of elections, but I'm not sure. So maybe Beverly or John can answer that, whether they're all elected at the same time or whether it's sort of on a cycle every 2 years, some are added. I don't know that process.
Yeah, there will be 8 elected once the statehood bill is passed. That 180 days, I think, which the Constitution calls for an election, an additional representative would be elected to each ward.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
And we
So-
will have a unicameral form of government, just like we do now. We will not have a House and a Senate. We will just have a state legislature.
Just like
state
Nebraska, see?
Right.
Yeah.
We're not unique there even.
Right. And again, the idea being that we wanted to, be as close to what we have now so that it, is easier and in terms of the
Seamless.
transition also. Yeah, seamless. Now, 2 years from the admission, if the Constitutional Convention, decides that they want to do a bicameral legislature, that's an opportunity to have that debate. But we decided that it made more sense in terms of it being seamless, as Beverly said, to keep it as close to what we have now as possible.
And I wasn't aware of that 2 years later. Kudos on that. That was very wise, I think, to be able to know from the start that we're going to be thinking about this as we go. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yep. All right. Well, maybe what we should, I can see that there's some things coming up in the chat. So Sharon, could you read us some of those questions?
Yes, indeed. Eleanor Hart wants to know, when during the 2-year transition do we elect senators and representatives?
Yeah, so there is a provision in the Admissions Act, right up front in the Admissions Act, which calls for pretty much the immediate election of the new representatives, because we won't have any to start with, because the office of the delegate is abolished, and we have these new offices which have to be filled of representative and of the 2 senators. So it says that not more than 30 days after receiving the certification from the president that we've been admitted to the union, that the mayor issues, or the new governor issues, a proclamation for the first elections of the 2 senators and representatives. So that will happen very quickly. And unlike these other things we're talking about in terms of 2 years, that'll be pretty fast.
Can I ask a question? I warned the folks that I was likely to ask a question. John, John or Beverly, was there thought given to having the current delegate become the new representative, just as the mayor becomes the governor and council members become representatives?
There was, and the current delegate, Eleanor Holmes Norton, counseled that, these are new offices. This is the office of the delegate is very different than a representative. She's tried to turn it into as close to a representative as possible, and I think has done a pretty good job of that, right? But these three are all new offices. They're not like the shadow reps. They're not, and so this is something that folks will have to run for because we're creating it anew.
And Kathy, there have been 6 states that have transitioned to statehood under this Tennessee plan, and they all have had elections following the passage of their Admissions Act.
Thank you.
Very helpful. So Sharon, do we have another one?
Yes, Joanna London wanted to know, do the judges who were appointed by the president have lifetime appointments?
No, our judges have 15-year appointments, and we kept that. And for the sake of continuity, particularly because the judicial system, we have to have a functioning judicial system, that we will not require everyone to be, who are judges now, to be reappointed by the governor. They will continue, they will be able to serve out their presidential term, so to speak. And then as new judges come, or as judges seek to be reappointed, they'd have to go through the process with the governor. And
John,
Yeah.
what would be confusing about that? We have both the state court function and the federal court function in DC. The president appoints both
Yes.
structures,
Thank you for
federal
clarifying.
and the state. The federal court judges have lifetime appointments, just like every other federal court all over the country. The state court judges, what John is talking about.
Correct. Thanks, Beverly.
So just as maybe as a follow-up to that, then how would that work? I mean, given that some are presidential and then with the ones that are, if you will, the state judges, has that been addressed as to what that would look like in the transition?
It would be the exact same way it is right now, except that the executive making the appointment would be the governor. We have a judicial nomination commission, and our judges are, what would I call that, John? They go before our judicial nomination commission, and they are selected. Their qualifications are established, and they are selected by the Judicial Nomination Commission to go on a list of 3 judges for each position. And the president has to pick one of those 3. The same would be with the governor.
Right. And there wouldn't be, it would be a little clunky because, some judges will have, commission on their wall signed by the president, and some judges will have a commission on their wall signed by the governor. But remember, all of these judges are ruling on DC law. So they rule on DC law now, even though they're appointed by the president because of the quirk of our system, right? And the judges who are appointed by the governor will rule on DC law. And over time, as judges retire, all of the judges ultimately will be appointed by the governor. But it's just a question of what's on their wall in terms of, who appointed them, but not in terms of their function.
And the sitting judges would remain.
Yes. Yeah, we thought it would be cataclysmic to our system if all of a sudden all of our judges weren't judges anymore and all had to sort of reapply. It made sense in terms of a transition to do it that way.
Okay. So I see a longer one from Julie Belts. Julie, maybe you could just unmute and talk about what's your question.
Yeah, I just, excuse me. I was wondering about the the quote unquote capital city, so to speak, of our new state? Like, would we be, us as a city state, we all technically live in the capital city, the capital of our state city. And we would be Washington, Douglas Commonwealth, and then the federal land address, like per our postal system, is Washington, DC. Like, are we both Washington? Like, I gave the example of Kansas City, but being in both Kansas and Missouri, or who's stealing the name? Who gets the state abbreviation? Are we going to have a throwdown and a fight over it? Or what are those logistics?
Go ahead, Beverly. Beverly this was her favorite name, and I love it too. I think it's a great name, but it's a little complicated.
There will both be Washington, D.C. The key thing is no one will have to change their stationery.
That's a nice way of looking at it.
Someone said that to me. They said, Beverly, if all those law firms have to change their stationery, they'll fight you tooth and nail. So no one
That's
has
funny.
Getting down to
So
the
the
brass tacks. Thank you.
As I said earlier, we are unique. We're going to still be a city, a county, and a state. We will be the state capital, all of that.
We'll be the state capital and we will have the nation's capital in our midst.
We will surround it.
Yes, keep our eyes on it.
And be represented in it. Oh my goodness, wouldn't that be something?
Yes.
So one of the other things that I'm thinking about is, we've talked about how these people get into place for the new positions. And what I'm wondering about is, are there ways for us to start thinking it through? So because it seems to me that our population, our group, our communities need to be able to think through how we move into this. And I'm curious whether you all have been thinking about how to, do we go down to the ANC, level and start saying to them, look, we're going to be a state. What happens to the ANCs? That's one of the questions that I've had is, what happens to the ANCs?
Well, there's a simple answer to that, Anne, which is nothing. We put them right into the Constitution because, the mayor and the council and the Statehood Commission recognized that is something that is unique in the district and powerful and something that's part of our culture and something that's important to us. And so we wrote it right in. So we're going to be the first state with an ANC system.
Well, my question is, are there educational blocks of information that we're putting together? Is somebody putting that stuff together so that you can take it to an ANC and say, let's have a conversation at your ANC level about what it's going to be like to be a state? Is that something that's in there?
Well, we did that during our statehood convention. We did a lot of that. We had a lot of handouts. But we don't do that on a regular basis. Our education, our current education efforts are educating people in other states to try to garner more support for statehood. But, and as a matter of fact, during the Constitutional Convention, the mayor had the whole Constitution and all of the premises printed in the Informer. So we had a special edition of the Informer newspaper with the new Constitution.
I also think, Beverly, you've done a nice job, you and the executive with the website. There's a special place on the city's website with all of the statehood stuff and the arguments for statehood, and it's written in plain language so that anybody can read it and understand it, and the documents are all there. if you want to read them. And I think, folks should be more aware of that, and should take a look at it. I know I still go to it and use it. I mean, I think it was very, very well done. And I think is an important resource for district residents.
And John, we also have kiosks.
That's right.
Down. We have one at the convention center, one at Union Station, I think in the Ronald Reagan building. And I think Bouker says we're getting a couple of more. So we have a kiosk that you can go to and sign up, just scroll on it and see all the issues about statehood. And it shows you how to reach your congressman, all of that. So, and we plan to do more of that. We're putting it everywhere so people can't get away from the issue. And I don't know, Ann, if you recall, we have our 51 Stars flag. And the other day on Flag Day, we had Pennsylvania Avenue lined with flags. And the uniqueness about our flags, they have 51 stars. And we have done that for many special occasions. So, we're trying to educate people on this issue.
Well, and you've done a great job. I mean, I think of moments like, when President Obama stood up, after John Lewis died and talked about, what are the 10 things we can do in the spirit of John Lewis, to make our country more inclusive and more equitable. And one of the 10 things was DC statehood, and that sort of thing and yes, he's a supporter of DC statehood, has been a supporter, but for him to choose that moment, that would have never been possible without the kind of visibility that particularly Beverly and the mayor, but the council too, have brought to this. I mean, this is a real issue now. It's not just us, talking about it. A lot of people talk about this, all over the country, and it's part of the national conversation. When we're talking about, the John Lewis voting rights bill and, making sure that we get voting rights legislation through the Congress, this is now part of that conversation. And that just wouldn't have been possible, 10, 20 years ago.
Go
ahead.
For Emancipation Day, we have made Emancipation Day our call for our rights for statehood. And so we have done, everything we've done around that has centered around advancing our issues. And we developed a documentary that just won a whole bunch of awards. And there's a press release about that. And you can go on our website and read about the Telly Awards, that we received 7 awards for our documentary about the history of Washington, D.C. And so we had that documentary. We paid to have it shown in South Carolina, in West Virginia. We picked a few states to have that shown. And we do commercials in West Virginia and in Arizona. I don't know why we picked those 2 states.
I was gonna say, why'd you pick those, Beverly?
Who knows? Who knows?
I don't know
Random.
why we picked those states, but we do have commercials going in those states. And so, we keep at it, and people have ideas, please shoot them to me, shoot them to Bouker. We're still on this.
Yep. And
I
so
believe it can happen. I am the most optimistic person in Washington, D.C. I believe it can become a reality. And in my lifetime, and soon, I believe it can become a reality this year.
well, Beverly, that is why we are having this discussion tonight, because it could happen. I mean, I'm talking like my kid, right? It could happen.
Yeah.
No? And if it does, then we need to know what we're going to be facing and how we're going to manage it and what kinds of things we need to be thinking about. And so that's one of the reasons we're doing this. And just just to be clear, we've talked about election of senators and representatives. We've talked about this transition body that's in the Admissions Act, not in the Constitution, which I think, thank you, John, for making that important distinction that we have to look at both of those to understand how it's all gonna function well. We've talked about these various pieces. What I haven't heard a lot about is the sort of agency level. And I'm assuming that they would continue the way they have been, but let me just ask that question. Are there any things that you can see about the way the agencies would work as in the process of this transition?
I wonder if we should be thinking about whether there are things in the Constitution that could be, that where we could move to those changes now. I know there were in the past, there have been discussions, for example, about increasing the size of the council. So the Constitution envisions, you know, the General Assembly with 21 members. Is that something that we should seek to do as a transition step now, short of statehood, and then it means less of a transition with statehood, or other elements in the Constitution that we should think about doing? I'm going to ask that as a question. It's not necessarily advocacy, but I just wonder if that would be one way to sort of keep moving in the direction of the changes that we will want to see with statehood, or if there are other examples from within the text of the Constitution. And I would ask Beverly and John, because you're much more familiar with that than I am.
Well, you know, we have the New Columbia Statehood Commission that was created by the council, and it is made up of the chairman, the mayor, and the 3 members of the shadow delegation. And we have addressed that issue before. So you saw me smiling. I won't say who is the most opposed to. I won't say who is the most opposed to making that change, but it took tough negotiations to get the assembly increased to 21 members.
Yes, I remember that.
Yes. And with respect to your question about agencies, I mean, I think that it would be prudent, and I know Beverly and the mayor have thought about this, you know, and are working on it. I know, for example, with respect to the criminal justice system, to have sort of statehood transition plans, you know, for each of the agencies, so that you have these internal plans that the agencies look at their functions and say, okay, this is what we do now. And when we're a state, we're going to do the same thing, or we're going to do something different. And so that's important to have all of those plans so that they're ready to roll, as Kathy says, as we go through this transition.
Yeah, we have a draft transition plan, and we work with agencies to see what would change in their functions. And so, yes, we've done that.
I mean, the fact of the matter is not much would. In terms of the day-to-day work of the government, the biggest changes, I think, would be what I would call the Revitalization Act agencies. You know, the agencies under the Revitalization Act where we gave up either, you know, control or we gave up costs that would be coming back to us. Those are the things that, you know, we have to be very, very careful of. And also, you know, Beverly has also mentioned, you know, to me in previous conversations and others that, you know, there will be issues of land use, you know, for example, you know, we've got all these little federal pocket parks all over the District of Columbia, you know, are we going to get all of those, you know, in terms of the state, or will some of those remain federal? There'll be all sorts of negotiations, you know, like that. So those are all things that, you know, probably will require a little more thought than, okay, you know, what's going to happen in the Department of Human Services now, you know, that sort of thing.
Right. Right. And
well, you know, one way that you know, now our regional delegation, not our regional executives. The mayor, the two governors, Maryland and Virginia, we meet 3 or 4 times a year. I was going to say quarterly. And we rotate the host of that. And sometimes we have substantive discussions by our various cabinet members, either, Secretary of Transportation from Virginia and our Director of Transportation here in Maryland, here in DC, and the Maryland Transportation Secretary. And so operation-wise, there is no different. Our guys it's just a director and there's our secretaries. That's literally the only difference in what they do.
Right.
And we're very much like a state already in so many different ways. One of the things we used to have in our talking points, I don't know if we have it anymore, is that, the federal government treats the District of Columbia as if it were a state in more than 500 different ways under federal law. It's always, the 50 states and the District of Columbia. And there's a reason for that, because we, for all intents and purposes, in all of these ways, like Beverly described, we operate as if we're a state now. And so not only are we ready to be yeah, go ahead.
In the CARES Act, the one time they didn't.
Right. At first, but you corrected it. You got them.
We got it back.
You got it back.
We got it fixed. It took a lot, but we got it done.
Yep. Exactly. All right. Well, I can see that we're closing in on our time frame. So I want to ask for any, anything that our panelists have. Oh, darn, I wish I'd said that. This is the time to say, go ahead and say it rather than wish later. And then we'll move to closing.
I don't have I wish I'd said that. Well, I probably will the second after we get off this call. But I would just like to thank the League again, not only for, putting on this panel, but again, you all have been stalwarts for this. Over many, many years. And we're going to need every single one of you if we're going to get it done this year, as Beverly promises us we will.
Well, we are going to the National Biennial Convention next week with a team of 6. And we will be fanning out in a listening tour to find out what in the world they're thinking that they don't have us as a state yet. So we'll be proceeding to do a lot of lobbying and a lot of getting a resolution passed and things like that. So we'll work.
Well, I just want to join John and thank you all for hosting this. And I was just really tickled about this transitional presentation, because that is so positive. And as I said to you, I'm so optimistic about this. It just made me so happy that
someone wants to talk about transition.
You want to talk about transition. So thank you.
And the only thing I would add is that these are all iterative issues. We build upon the past and we build upon the great work that you all have done. I mentioned it. In the period of time, the 8 years I was out of DC government, we got budget autonomy. So thank you to all of you who worked on that. And I really do appreciate the time and the energy and the commitment that folks here tonight have been giving for so many years. Thank you.
All right. And, I see that we have Sam Smith has joined us. Now, I don't know how many of you know Sam Smith, but his mind is the one that put together this idea of statehood the way we're thinking about it. Sam, would you like to say anything here? You need to get unmuted. You're not unmuted yet. There you are.
No, I just say it's real exciting to see what you're all up to. I'm afraid I've moved to Maine, so I'm not as involved as I once was, but Keep it going. Keep it going.
All right. Well, thank you, sir, for the brilliant idea. All right, let me turn it back over to you, Kathy. Sure.
All right, well, this was fabulous. What an amazing panel. Each of our panelists did. We've learned so much from each of you. It was really terrific. And thank you, Anne and Sharon and the rest of the team for pulling this together. Really, really wonderful. Just lots to learn. And then towards the end, when we're talking about some of the transition pieces, it was interesting. Anne and I have had, over the course of our working together, we talked a lot about this two-prong approach to our educating about statehood. One is the 50 states, the people who, some of them don't even know that we're not a state. And the other is us, the people who live here, who have all these questions. What's going to happen? What's going to happen to my taxes? Which we're going to talk about at the next one, the next panel in July. But so it's really, shall I say, reassuring to know that we're all on this same path and journey together. It's been really good. And as Anne mentioned, the convention, there'll be about 500 in-person people there, and I think an equal number or more attending virtually. We'll all be wearing 51 statehood buttons. We are presenting a resolution that will be presented to the floor of the convention. We're hosting a caucus, and included in that is an exhibit of our quilts for DC, and that's been a super educational piece. The prong that goes to the community at large. So you've all seen that, I'm sure, on our website, and we'll soon have another or several in-person opportunities to see all the quilts. So it just all came together. The panel was brilliant, and the team to put this together was wonderful. I'm really excited. This is good. I'm all of a sudden really energized. I was a little, tired at one point, and now I'm like pumped, ready. This was super. So we'll let you all know when it's the recording will be loaded. It'll be on our website, and it just perfect. The next event is, let me just make sure I have the right day, July 21st, Envisioning DC Statehood, What It's Worth, from 7 to 8:30 p.m. So watch for announcements on Twitter and email. If you're not on our newsletter, please sign up on our website. For those of you who are not yet members, you can join the League. You can join our statehood team. We know it's something you're interested in, so help us get it in this year. We're going to take that challenge from Beverly. So thank you all for coming, and thank you to the great panelists.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Good night, all.
Thanks, everyone.
Be well, stay well.